Some people think we're heretics right now, but that's okay. That's all right.
Well, to add to that, to give them more ammunition, I think a rough analogy to group personhood in the case of the Trinity would be something like those cartoons, like Voltron and Power Rangers, where the they form
you can't go there.
Distinct, unique character that can't be reduced to just the individuals that make them up. I think the Father, Son, and Spirit are a tightly knit, unified group in a way that they form a distinct agent and person to whom we can relate to in a singular way.
Yeah. Did you see the YouTube video I sent you?
I watched it. Yeah.
Had you seen that before or no?
Maybe years ago.
Okay.
It's familiar, but yeah.
So people at home are using their Irish accents, and we got leprechauns or clovers in the background here for those listening in audio, but they're going to say that's partialism, Patrick. That's a heresy. And I've looked that up. I've used that in class before, and a lot of times my professors won't know what I'm talking about if they haven't seen that video. I haven't seen like a council condemning that, and I looked for it even today, and I looked at the video again. It's St. Patrick's Bad Analogies. I recommend everyone watch that on YouTube. It's great. But the analogy they give or the example they give of someone, a heretic who used that, is Voltron, like you just said. Then it's a joke, but it's like you probably should have thrown in some real evidence if you think that's a heresy. If partialism is a heresy, you should have said, and here's where it was rejected at this council, this date. So in that sense, you would be like a partialist according to them, right?
Yeah, I think let's talk about partialism a little bit later, because that comes up more naturally when we start talking about God having parts.
I missed this earlier, but there's a Mereological simple cannot explain itself because it has this bootstrapping problem.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of this because of quarks. I don't really know what quarks are, if they're like made up of something or whatever, but can you just explain why a Mereological simple cannot explain itself and how the bootstrapping works?
Yeah. I just don't see how an absolutely simple being can have an explanation, since it can't have an external explanation, since we're imagining this Mereological simple existing all by itself, and having no real distinctions between anything within this simple being. There can't be anything internal to explain it. There's nothing internal for an explanatory relation to squeeze between.
Yeah.
There's just nothing in there for explanatory relation to grab hold of. So a simple being is straightforwardly in violation of the principle of sufficient reason.
Yeah. So you'd have to, if you wanted to say there is a Mereological simple, then you'd have to let go of the principle of sufficient reason.
If the Mereological simple exists like all by itself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so
God could create a Mereological simple, presumably, but then that simple thing depends on something outside of itself.
Right. And that's exactly what your premises got at. There's a change of things sufficiently explained or wholly. Okay. So God could create that, just a world of if a quark or a superstring or whatever you want to say is Mereological simple. Okay. But a Mereological simple cannot be the ground of all things.
That's right. It can't be. Yeah. If we're imagining nothing being prior to it, it can't be fundamental is what I'm saying. It can't be. Yeah. Nothing prior to this thing. If it's Mereological simple, that is a violation of the PSR. Yes.
Yeah. And so this necessitates a rejection of divine simplicity. A certain type of, maybe the austere, or certain types of, most types probably of divine simplicity.
Yeah, at least the strong types associated with like Aquinas, for example. Yeah, absolutely. Even, there is a sense in which I want to affirm simplicity, in that God is a unified being. God is a unity of sorts. And he's simple in that he can't be like decomposed or broken down or, is subject to corruption. Yeah. But yeah, that's a different sense of simplicity than what's operating in like the doctrine of divine simplicity. Yeah.
And so you might say that the persons of the Trinity comprise the Godhead, and each person is an inseparable part, though not Mereologically simple. God is not Mereologically simple. But he's composed of inseparable parts. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think Chris comes up with like this lowest common denominator, which I think that would fit for a chastened simplicity in his analyzing doctrine, which is interesting. I got to think about that more. That's good. But so then you move on there to that fifth premise. Do you want to cover anything else before we go into the fifth one?
That's good. That's just my motivation for thinking if all we have to explain this being is something internal to the being, the obvious candidate is going to be a thing's parts.
Yeah.
And by part, I mean something broad. I don't mean like a physical constituent or anything like that. I just mean a thing's on whatever's the ontologically salient structural thing that makes the thing it is, makes it the thing that it is.
Okay. So premise 5 there is really interesting. So we got through 4 premises, and so number 4 was something whose explanation is wholly in itself is sufficiently explained by its parts. So now we go into the parts, and premise 5 is something whose sufficient explanation is in its parts requires at least 3 proper parts which mutually explain each other. That's quite a claim. I like that a lot.
It is quite a claim, but this is the main argument, the main novel argument of my dissertation. So we have this thing who's explained by its parts, but if everything has an explanation, well, that just pushes it back a bit. What explains the parts, right? So I want to say, well, it can't be parts all the way down, and it can't be parts explaining each other in a manner of like, chicken and egg scenarios. That would be viciously circular. So most cases so I want to say it can't be all the way down. The parts must somehow mutually explain each other, but they can't mutually explain each other in this viciously circular way. But all the cases of vicious circularity like this, the chicken and egg scenario, are ones where you have 2 terms, A and B, where A explains B and B explains A. Obviously viciously circular.
Yep.
Now, it's a classic problem of which came first, chicken or egg. But not all cases of mutual dependence are like this, like the chicken and the egg. So consider magnets. The north and south poles of a magnet do explain each other, but there's more that enters this explanatory picture, namely the magnetic field itself.
Yeah.
Other examples of this sort of tripartite mutual dependence, it's not binary, it's like ternary, it's tripartite, are ones where like you have a relation between mass, density, and volume.
Yeah.
Each sort of mutually explains each other.
Yeah.
You have hylomorphic compounds of matter, form, and that which conjoins them. You have certain subatomic particles like protons and neutrons, which are made up of quark triplets that can't exist without each other. They sort of explain why the other exists. So you can't, the lesson here is that you can't have just two things that depend or explain only each other. But you can have mutual dependence when you have 3 things that partially and mutually explain each other.
Yeah.
So the structure here is not like a loop, which is viciously circular. It's more like a web.
Which is so funny, because it's like you could make a joke about that, be like, well, the problem with all of you guys, you only have 2, and if you had a 3rd thing, and then it's like, wait a second, that actually works. That's fantastic. So how'd you think of that? Like, where did that come from? Was that because you were already thinking about the Trinity, or was that something that was like a aha moment where like, hey, this actually might work for the Trinity?
That's a good question. I don't know where I thought of this.
The magnet thing gets me. I like that one a lot. North Pole, North South Pole, and then the field.
I was working with Karen Bennett on my dissertation, and I was very interested in the literature on mutual dependence, mutual ground, and I thought of a lot of these examples on my own, and only to discover like draft work of philosophers who are discussing a lot of the same examples that I have drafts in my work. I'm like, no, I got scooped.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I just remember doodling one day, exploring different ways something could be mutually related. And you could have, A, B, arrow going from A to B, from B to A. That's circular. Then what if you add a 3rd thing with the same sort of arrows, but all going to each other? That's sort of a next level, a level of complexity.
Yeah.
I was thinking of like, well, is that problematic? And say, no, it's not. And notice how that's different from A, B, C, where the arrows only go in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that is viciously circular.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, because you could have 4, 5, 6, 7. But yeah.
It wouldn't even matter as long as it loops back in on itself.
Yeah.
So it gets a little technical as the way I cash it out in the dissertation, but the relations here, the arrows represent partial ground, not full ground. So if A partially grounds B, B partially grounds A, the same thing with B and C, and same thing with C and A. They all sort of partially ground but fully ground each other, which avoids this loopy structure because it's more like web-like.
That's so fantastic. That's so interesting. So then the thing that grounds everything else, which has to it has to ground everything else, so it has to explain itself. The sufficient number for that thing, the sufficient number of the parts of that thing are 3.
Mm-hmm.
And so God is 3. If God is this necessary ground, metaphysical ground, then he must be composed of 3 parts.
Yeah, that's right. So you need at least 3 things in order to have in order to have a being that is sufficiently explained in itself.
Yeah. Ah, that's so cool. That's so cool. So
now, yeah, obviously I'm thinking of the parts as divine persons, right? Father, Son, and Spirit. The triune God is explained by the divine persons, and the divine persons explain each other. Nothing goes unexplained. The PSR, we can have the PSR, but it comes with this view of God as having parts. But notice how I drew that picture again, is how they're all sort of like mutually related to each other. And this just fits so well with the doctrine of perichoresis that you mentioned before. And I mean, it's kind of an outdated term at this point, but theologians used to talk of the doctrine of perichoresis in terms of the mutual interpenetration of the persons. So I think that this model, this way of structuring God, is a way of making sense of that.
And and you don't get God with just 2 persons of the Trinity.
Right.
And it's like, that's we've always said that. Yeah, of course. Of course, that's right. I really like that. When you start saying parts, everyone's hairs start going up. Even my own hairs go up. When you say the 3 persons of the Trinity, oh yeah, naturally. Okay, well, that's what he's saying. So if we do have to let go of simplicity, or at least a strong sense of simplicity, what do we do about aseity? Can we still have aseity without simplicity?
It depends on what you mean by aseity. So some philosophers claim that God can be ase only if God is simple, since to be ase is to be independent.
Yeah.
And to be independent is to just be not dependent on anything, period. But only a simple being can be independent in that sense. Now, there's a big problem with this view, and it's known as the doctrine of the Trinity. all agree that there are at least some dependence relations within the Godhead. The Son is begotten of the Father, for instance.
Yeah.
Eternal generation is a dependence relation. Yet the Son is said to be ase. So which is it? Is aseity independence, or is the Son not dependent on the Father? So this is a great example of where I think it's a mistake to articulate divine attributes in abstraction from other divine attributes. We can't just consult our perfect being intuitions and arrive at a conception of an attribute in isolation from the others.
Yeah.
So I agree with classical theists that aseity is incompatible with a certain kind of dependence, namely asymmetric dependence. Asymmetric dependence on something external, since that does plausibly imply that whatever, if A depends on B, but not vice versa, well, then B is somehow greater than A.
Right. Totally.
Right. I think that's probably right. I think there's something to that intuition.
Same.
But note, on the model I sketch, no person depends on the other in that way. They all mutually depend on each other. There is no asymmetric dependence between the persons. There's only mutual dependence. And so long as you have mutual dependence, I don't see how any intuitions, at least base intuitions about imperfection relating to asymmetric dependence, is going to be a problem.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that you've shown through these 5 this argument of 5 premises that we mentioned, that if you want to be ase, meaning if you want to be something that explains itself, and you want to still have PSR, then you need 3 parts. And so I think that's so interesting to think through. And so if you do want aseity, then you might need to let go of this strong version of metaphysical simplicity.
At least aseity as rigidly. So I don't think you can have aseity without simplicity if aseity is rigidly defined as not being dependent on anything, period. But that's okay, because you can't have the Trinity then either.
Yeah.
So I'll just speak of the divine attribute of tri-aseity instead, not aseity, which we can define as the strongest form of independence that's compatible with the Trinity.
Tri-aseity. That's not bad, because we want to be good Trinitarians anyways. Right. Tri-aseity. And so like the necessary being, the ground of all existence, is tri-aseity.
Just tri-se,
dude, tri-se.
But
that's great. No, I like it. I hope someone runs with it. I might run with that, because I love. We need to be Trinitarian. We're Christians. We're Trinitarians. Yeah. Let's be Trinitarians in what we talk about. Without being, tritheists. Of course not. Of course not. Yeah, we want to say the Shema the way that Paul said it. Of course.
That's right.
But yeah, we should be Trinitarians. I love that.